Hi, I'm Elliot, and in this video I'm going to explain to you the 4 most common errors that people make when installing tile, why they're wrong, and what you should do instead. And don't think that these are errors that are only common among DIYers. These are errors that are also common among even professionals, so pay attention to the video. Now, to talk about the first error that people usually make when installing tiles, I actually want to take you to a room with a real tile installation already there so that we can see a little bit better what we're talking about. Come with me. The first of our 4 most common installation errors is skipping the planning process. And the reason that this isn't good is because if you skip the planning process, you're more likely to end up with an unprofessional finish. So to get started, we're going to see first how the planning process is done correctly. The first step for properly planning your floor is to identify the central point of the room. And that is, of course, the point in the room that is most equidistant between the walls. In the case of this room, this is the central point. So what I'm going to do is lay a tile over it, and then I'm going to lay a row of tiles along the length of the room and another row of tiles along the width of the room. This is basically going to create a cross whose intersection is at the central point on the floor. The reason it's good to have this cross of tiles laid over the center of the room is because it shows you how the tiles are going to fit in the room. In almost all installations, you need to make cuts on the tiles so that they fit next to the walls. So what you want to do is you want to see how much of the tiles you're going to have to cut along each wall, and if in a certain case you need to cut more than 50% of the tile off for the installation to fit, what you want to do is actually move the central tile so that it's a little bit off-center, but you're able to now install at least 50% of the original surface of the tile on the floor. The reason for this is because it makes it look much more professional at the end of the installation, and if you end up installing a really thin strip of tile along the wall to make everything fit, it really just doesn't look good. Also, those thin strips are pretty difficult to cut. Sometimes what we hear from people when we tell them about the importance of planning your floor before you actually do the installation is that they've tried planning their floor before in just the way we explained, and the actual execution of the installation didn't turn out the way they planned for. The reason for this is usually because they either didn't include space for the tile-to-tile joints in their planning, or the space that they did include wasn't the same as the space that they actually ended up using in the end. So in order to avoid this problem and make sure that your planning really represents precisely how your final product is going to be, you can use spacers in between the tiles on the cross that you lay over the center of the floor. That way, you know exactly how much space the tiles and the joints are going to take up, and you'll get exactly the same outcome in your planning as you do in the execution of the installation. Now that we've finished our planning, what we're going to do is we're going to find the door to the room, and we're going to actually begin the installation with the adhesive and everything in the opposite corner of the room, in this case, this corner. That way, when the installation is finished, you'll be able to exit the room without actually stepping on any of the tiles you've installed. A second really common mistake that people tend to make when installing tiles is misusing the adhesive. One of the reasons that people often misuse adhesive is because they think that different types of tiles or different tile materials are going to work in the same way with the adhesive. Because of this, it's really common for people to make the mistake of wetting the underside of a porcelain tile like they would with the underside of a more porous material like white paste. The reason you don't want to wet the underside of a porcelain tile before you lay it over adhesive is because the water you lay here doesn't get absorbed into the tile because it has no pores, or it has very, very, very little porosity. And the water you lay here actually ends up creating a barrier in between the tile and the adhesive, which minimizes adhesion. In the case of more porous materials, the water you lay here gets absorbed into the pores of the tile, and then when you lay the tile on top of the adhesive, the water that's inside the pores pulls the adhesive into the pores with it, and this helps with adhesion. We can actually see the difference in porosity and absorption between these two tiles if we wet their undersides. So if we take a sponge and we wet the underside of these two tiles, we will see that in the case of the porcelain tile and in the case of the white paste tile, Here, the water stays on top of the material, but here you can actually see the water kind of disappearing into the pores. You can also see the difference a little bit better if you try to dry these two materials, because in the case of the porcelain, you can see that the water's pretty much gone. Any bit of water that does stay on the tile is visible, and that's why the tile becomes a little bit shiny where it's wet. Whereas in the case of white paste and other similarly porous materials, no matter how much you dry it, you can still see a very clear stain where the water was, and that's because this is where the tile's pores have absorbed water. Another mistake people often make is mixing the adhesive incorrectly. The first thing you gotta do is follow the instructions on the bag. So, in this case, it says that we need to mix 6.5 liters of water if we wanna use the entire sack of adhesive. So, we've measured out the water first, the water is in the bucket, and now we're going to throw the adhesive on top of the water. It's also important to start using the adhesive the moment you've wet it and mixed it, because once the adhesive is wet, the chemical reactions that the adhesive is designed to do start taking place, and if those chemical reactions are used up before you lay the tile on top of it, then it's not going to bind. Another common error that people make has to do with the way they lay adhesive over the floor. One of the first ways that they do this incorrectly is by laying it in globs and not spreading it. As you can see, when you lay the adhesive in globs like this without combing it, you don't achieve the wetting that you need. Now I want to talk for a minute about the correct way to comb adhesive. When we comb adhesive, we have to lay it over the floor, and the reason that we're combing it is to create grooves in it. These grooves are going to act as channels for air to escape out from underneath the tile after it's been laid down. These grooves need to be as short and continuous as possible so that the air has an easy route to escape. Keeping this in mind, you can understand how a lot of the common ways in which people comb adhesive would be less than ideal. For example, a very common way in which people comb adhesive is in arcs or even in squiggles. Now, the channels that you're making for the air to escape when you comb the adhesive this way are a lot longer than they would be if you were to just comb in a straight line. Another common and less than ideal way in which people often comb their adhesive is they will comb the adhesive in one direction correctly on the floor in a straight line, but then they'll take their tile and they'll comb the adhesive in the other direction so that the grooves that they're creating with the trowels are actually crossing each other rather than going in the same direction. What this ends up doing is basically trapping the air because you're not creating channels for it to go through. Instead, you're creating sort of a square-shaped grid of pockets in which it's going to get stuck. Like I said before, when we comb adhesive, the idea is to create grooves that are as short and continuous as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to comb in a straight line, like we said before, and we're going to do it in the direction of the short side of the tile. So in this case, it would be following this direction, and we would comb like so. You also want to remember that you need the grooves that you comb into the adhesive that's on the floor to be parallel with these grooves. Another common error that people often make is that they don't do back buttering. And back buttering is important because without it, you're probably not going to get an adequate wetting, and you're definitely not going to get an ideal wetting. Occasionally, as you're doing your installation, it might be a good idea to lift up a tile to make sure that your adhesive is working well and that your technique is working well. So in the event that you do lift up one of these tiles, what you want to see is something like this. This is what good adhesive transmission looks like. If you're dealing with small formats, back buttering isn't really necessary. But if the format is 30 by 30 or bigger, or has a length of 40 centimeters or longer, then you definitely need to do it. It's important to remember that not all adhesives are good for all projects and all materials. There's adhesives that are specifically for porcelain, and if you have, for example, a project in which you are going to install white paste over a plaster wall, there's also an adhesive specific for that combination of materials. Another mistake that some people make is that they do an entire installation and they don't use adequate space for the joints, or they don't use any joints at all. The joints, even if the client doesn't like the way they look, are very necessary. The reason that tile-to-tile joints are so important is because the environmental pressures that a tile will be under, like people stepping on it and temperature changes, will cause the tiles to move just a little bit, and if there's nothing in between the tiles, like the grout in a tile-to-tile joint, then they're going to press against each other hard enough that they will eventually crack, and this will make the life of the installation much, much shorter. Another reason that joints are important is that no matter how good the fabrication of the tiles that you're installing is, there's going to be tiny differences in their dimensions, and the joints allow us some flexibility so that these tiny differences in their dimensions don't totally ruin the installation. Tile-to-tile joints are also important because they allow for a space for the water to escape from beneath the tile, which is how the adhesive dries. And if the client doesn't like the way the tile-to-tile joints look, you can always offer them the suggestion of installing really large format tiles, which require fewer joints and minimize their appearance. Another common mistake people make is making square holes using blades when they need to perforate instead of using a drill bit. And the reason that people do this is because back in the day, drill bits were a lot more expensive than blades, so this was an economically more efficient way of making a hole. Nowadays this isn't the case, so it's much quicker and economically more efficient to drill your holes using a drill bit. That's our video on the 4 most common errors that people tend to make when they are installing tiles. If you want to learn more about tile installations, then you can read our blog or follow us on our social media. And I'll see you soon.